She's known as the grandmother of sexploitation films, despite the fact that there wasn't a lot of sex in her films, at least most of her films. She did have sex in some of them. And with the early films that have a lot of nudity that kind of kicked off this genre, there was no sex at all because of censorship laws. So it's just mainly a lot of nudity. And it was full on nudity because they didn't want to rock the boat, a lot of these filmmakers. I think what started things off was the nudist camps movies. And I think those came out in the 30s when a lot of those exploitation films started, like Cocaine Fiends and Reefer Madness. I think there were some nudist films around that time. And for whatever reason, in the late 50s, they made a resurgence. And that's when Doris Wishman kind of jumped in on things.
Yeah, I think you could kind of get away with those nudist films because they were educational. You know, this is about the nudist camps or the nudist movement. It's kind of an educational film.
Yeah, I think there was also a Supreme Court ruling as well that it couldn't be viewed as obscene if it's part of a lifestyle as well.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
they kind of skirted around the censorship laws in a lot of different ways. And I think keeping it on the camps helped in getting past censorship and not showing like the full frontal, like it's just mainly waist up and from behind is where they kind of like say, okay, they kind of self-censored themselves in a way. So it's like, all right, we'll just go by these rules and we won't rock the boat too much. And all right, if you guys don't go too far, then we'll look the other way as well on both sides.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the Supreme Court decision is when they did then do full frontal after that, because they basically said nudity is not obscene. So you could get away with it after that point. But before the decision, I think they kind of shied away from full frontal.
Okay. I mean, I've seen a decent amount of those nudist films. I haven't seen any with full frontal.
Wow.
I guess maybe it was just Wishman and some of the others that I did see. Mainly the nudist films I've seen was released from Something Weird video. So I didn't
Yes.
notice any of the ones that I saw that had the frontal.
I don't remember which ones had it, but I do remember seeing a trailer where they kept saying the Supreme Court has ruled nudity is not obscene, and they were showing you full frontal nudity in the trailer. So that was an example of a movie that was exploiting the decision by the court. So I can't remember what that would have been, but I suspect it was later, like late 60s or maybe even very early 70s. I'm not sure.
Hmm. Okay. Interesting. So Wishman herself, I think she got into this business after her husband died. I think at very early age, like 31 or something. I think from what I read, they were separated at the time anyway. And she was kind of working in the film industry on the distribution side. So when she saw these movies were making a lot of money and they look kind of simple to make, I think she said to herself, "Well, I can do this." And she did, but barely. Uh, so the next iteration of these type of films was the Nudie-cuties, and I think those were categorized as the nudist films that added a little bit more genres to it and came off of the camps. And Wishman did hers inadvertently. When she went to the New York Censorship Board, she showed them, I think it's Nude on the Moon or something with the moon. This isn't a nudist camp. She's like, no, it's a nudist camp on the moon, though. Yeah. So they rejected her claim, of the fact that it was a nudist film because they weren't actually on a nudist camp, and it was more of a genre film where she was trying to do like a space movie. So I don't think it was released in New York, not initially, but other places. And movies like that, I think, is what kind of developed the genre a little bit more when people started getting off of the camps.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think her most successful nudist film before she moved on to other things was Blaze Star Goes Nudist. And I think that was 62. And Blaze Star, I guess at the time, was a stripper, or maybe she started stripping afterwards. But she had affairs with different famous people and got some notoriety from that. And I think towards the latter end of her career, that's when Doris Wishman got a hold of her and put her in it. And it was kind of like a significant name for these type of movies, which basically had like, models just desperate for money because this wasn't really anything that would push you anywhere in your career as far as any aspirations of being a legitimate actor. And that was, yeah, I think that was the most popular of our nudist films. And Nudie-cuties, the genre developed more because I think it was David Friedman that said there's only so many ways you can shoot people playing volleyball. And because with these nudist films, it was be very little plot because you had to be on a camp. So you'd have people playing volleyball, swimming, talking. A lot of the tropes was you'd have someone who didn't think that, being on a nudist farm, it's kind of like a farm. They're like animals. They're all cattled out there. But the nudist camp, I think it would be someone who would think, oh, it's wrong, or they'd be like a prude. Then they'd go on the camp either as a reporter or undercover, and they say, oh my God, this is wonderful. And then they'd be nude by the end of the movie. And that plot was in a lot of them. I don't know how much you watch, but it seemed like that was a plot to a lot of these type of films. And again, the main footage of the reason why people went there was for the nudity, and there's only so much that you can show people doing nude. And it's funny too, because a lot of these shots, as you mentioned, there were some that had full frontal nudity, but the ones I saw, when the actors were, or the models or the nudists were facing the camera, they had pants on. And then when the camera was behind them, they had no pants on, because they had to skirt around that in some way. But there was only so far I could go. And I think by like the mid 60s, early to mid 60s, it kind of phased out. It was just like maybe 4 or 5 years. And then eventually censorship laws loosened up a little bit. And that's where you got roughies.
Right. Yes. I didn't see a ton of the nudist movies, but I remember people carrying towels around. Does that sound familiar? Like they'd carry a towel and it would strategically be in front of their crotch so you couldn't really see anything.
Yes.
That's what I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, they did that too as well. Yeah, yeah. A towel, a beach ball, something would be in front of their genitalia. Convenient
right.
when the camera was facing them, if it wasn't like a close up or like a medium shot.
Yes.
But yeah, as those type of films wore themselves out, the nudist films and the Nudie-cuties, roughies added element of violence to it. You still couldn't show, again, with the nudist films, there was no sex. It was just nudity. With the roughies, you couldn't really do sex either. So it was a lot of sex talk. And for me, of these different sex, not sex, not sex, sex, of these type of films, this was my favorite one. It almost felt like Twilight Zone-ish, some of the plots and things like that, but they were categorized by going going black and white because these nudist films were generally in color. I think almost all roughies were black and white. They all had jazz music, and most of them had male protagonists. That's where Doris Wishman was kind of different. A lot of her films had female protagonists, but it was a lot of violence against women, and it was a lot of talking about sex when the sex was actually happening. And then when the sex was over, then we'd see a little bit of nudity and things like that. But they couldn't actually show sex. They showed the lead up to sex and a lot of sex talk. And that was my favorite part of the genre to me, is that the titles and the sex talk. I wrote down a few: wanton desires, insatiable lust, carnal passion, sex without shame, corrupt and immoral, a woman too much for man, lust was my destiny, I found my body but lost my soul. These are just, I don't know, I find these so hilarious, and they do them so dramatically as well. But yeah, to me, that's what really attracted me. Those trailers that had a few of those, a lot of that dialogue, and some of the violence and stuff like that. That's what really attracted me
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting when you hear about roughies, you hear about it both in terms of these sort of softcore films that we're talking about now, but also hardcore films. There are a lot of hardcore roughies that I guess came along later, but that's not really so much what we're talking about now. We're talking about these 1960s kind of pre-hardcore adult films.
Yeah, yeah. And I think Russ Meyer was credited with starting the Roughie because
Oh
he
yeah,
was someone that liked black and white photography. He is someone we should highlight at some point as well, but he's so incredibly talented to be working in smut. It was just ridiculous. Like you'd see some of the shot compositions in his films,
mhm.
and you compare it to the content, and it'd be like, dude, these shots look as good as like any Hollywood movie, but here's just like some woman with giant tits running around with a dildo. You know, it's his
Yeah,
desires and his carnal lust for big-breasted women was just insane because his talent was just so much better than his material. But I think
yeah,
he was the one credited with starting these type of films in the mid 60s. And like you said, these were mainly a 60s type film. And when you got into, I think 1972, that's when Deep Throat came out. Censorship
mhm,
was really relaxed, and you had hardcore porn, and it became harder for a lot of these filmmakers because they didn't necessarily. I think a lot of their appeal was just like pushing the envelope. But when there's
mhm.
like, all right, there's no envelope to push, you could just do whatever you want. There, a lot of them didn't really want to do anything. They just mainly wanted to just like see what they can get away with. But if they can get
Yeah,
away with anything, a lot of them just kind of like either faded away because they were getting older anyway, or they just didn't have a lot of interest in doing the hardcore stuff. But yeah, when Deep Throat came out, not only did you have hardcore porn, but you had like live sex shows in New York and different places like that. So the climate definitely changed with these movies.
for sure. And Russ Meyer, I think, was one of the few guys who sort of was able to continue making not hardcore films. They were kind of close, but they weren't quite hardcore because he had enough of a fan base. People really liked what he did. So they would kind of keep going to his films, even though they could have gone to a more hardcore film. And it's interesting to see Doris Wishman also continued on. She made movies long after this era kind of ended. And I think she maybe did dabble in hardcore at one point. Is that right?
Yes,
She
she did.
making
Yeah.
yeah.
So we talked about some of the nudist films she did, and we also talked about Nude on the Moon, the Nudie-cutie that she did. And later on, we'll be reviewing one of her roughies. She did make a lot of decent roughies. Bad Girls Go to Hell, just that title alone is just great. Um, Too Much Too Often, Another Day, Another Man. She made some really good roughies. I think that's what most people who know of her would know of her from. But you're right. As the roughies started to fade out in the 70s, you either had to come up with like really good gimmicks. You had to have a fan base, like you said, with Russ Meyer. And not just the fan base, but he was just, as I mentioned before, just a really talented filmmaker. So even though the content was a little bit not as edgy as others, his execution was so much better than everyone else. I mean, you
Yeah,
compare the look of a Russ Meyer film with the look of any other like sex film in that era, hardcore or not, he was just so much more elevated than the rest of them. So yeah, so with Doris Wishman, I think she kind of held off on doing the hardcore, and she really went into the gimmicky type stuff. And she found her biggest success, and I use that word intentionally.
yeah,
Deadly Weapons, where I think the woman that was a star in it, her breast measured like 73 inches or something like that. Like the
yes. Chesty Morgan.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think she was a stripper who had a similar background to Doris in that she was very tiny and her husband died at an early age. But instead of getting into film, she got into stripping and then eventually hooked up with Doris. And then I think they were supposed to do a three-picture deal, but they never got along.
Mhm.
Chesty was kind of being a little bit of a diva, and Doris had her way, so they kind of clashed a lot. instead of doing the three movies, they did do the one, which I think was her biggest movie, biggest since Blaze Stargo's Nudist, and I think her biggest movie, period. I don't know if she made the most money from it because she sold the rights. She eventually got them back in time for home video when that became a thing in the 80s. But she did the one, and Double Agent 73, I think, was a sequel, but it was mainly a lot of like
Yes.
takes and stuff like that. I don't know if they actually went out and shot stuff. So there's just a bunch of footage that she had laying around. And the third one they were supposed to do, they killed off her character when the movie started. So it was
Mm.
just somebody laying under a sheet. Was supposed to be her, and that was the extent of her participation in what would have been the third movie they would have done together.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I didn't know about the third movie, but the first two I do know quite well. And I heard that she didn't really want to do the second one, but then she thought of the idea that Chesty Morgan would have a camera implanted in one of her breasts. And she thought that was such a great idea, she had to make the movie. That's what I heard.
That is such a terrible idea. Because all she would do is pull up her breast, and then you would hear a camera clicking. Like, where's the camera? Where's the flash? Like, none of
It's the
it makes.
power of imagination. You gotta imagine that the
Yeah.
camera's there.
Yeah, so and then I think another one of her gimmicks, she did some transgender stuff. We did talk about a movie that Ed Wood did when we did him, Glenn or Glenda. And I think a little bit around that time, a little bit after, Doris did one as well. I think Glenn or Glenda was late 60s and Doris did one in 71, but she didn't complete it and release it till later on in the 70s. But she was looking for gimmicks, and when the gimmicks didn't work, like you said, she ended up caving in and she did some hardcore porn. I think she did two or three. She denied it for a very long time, but later on in her life, when something weird started releasing all these movies, it's pretty easy to tell what a Doris Wishman film is, and it was obvious that those were the couple of the films that they found were Doris Wishman films. Satan Was a Lady and Come With Me, My Love, I think, were the two hardcore ones that she did.
Like Russ Meyer, she has a recognizable style.
Yes.
You can't mistake her style.
No, you can't. And you can't. You could imitate it, but I don't think you'd want to. Later on, I think she tried to dabble in slasher films in the late 70s, early 80s when that became a thing. And Night to Dismember was her slasher film. I don't know what happened because the stories are kind of convoluted, but I think the people who invested in the film, so it was kind of their film, and she was just shooting it. They saw the footage, and I think they were freaked out at how bad it was. I don't know if they didn't realize that she wasn't a very good filmmaker, and I think they didn't want it released. And she had just the outtakes and the takes she wasn't going to use. What Doris Wishman chooses to put in front of the camera, you can only imagine what she thinks isn't good enough to use. And she's one of these filmmakers like Ed Wood who shot one for one, where they basically use almost everything that they shot. But the footage that she wasn't going to use, she basically patched together, tried to call back some of the actors, and then released it that way. It's not a film I've seen. It's not a film I want to see. But she was able to release it. I did listen to the audio commentary on it though, just so I can get more interviews and more background and more stories about Doris. So I did hear the audio commentary, but I haven't watched the film.
I don't think I've seen that one either.
Yeah, so that was like the early 80s. And then I think she kind of retired for a while, went to Florida, worked in like a sex shop or something like that. And, with the release of her films on DVDs and Something Weird and things like that, she started to have a little bit of a following again. And then she, I think, made a couple of appearances on the Conan O'Brien Late Show, and that led to her doing a couple of more movies before she died. I think she got terminal cancer and ended up dying of pneumonia or something like that. But I think she lived till like 90 or something like so. She lived a really long and interesting life. But yeah, not a very good filmmaker. Obviously, we're talking about her not to rag on her. For some reason, myself and maybe you, I don't know, I haven't asked you, I hate for you to say you don't find her films endearing, because then I force you to watch one of her films. But there's something a little bit endearing about her. I know that there's a lot of feminists that try to recontextualize her films, being a female director in that type of just in industry at all. Prolific female director based on output, a male dominated genre or subgenres, and the fact that she had female protagonists in her films. A lot of feminists recontextualize her films and say she's a, pioneer and feminist in the feminist movement, and she completely denies it. She runs from it. She's like, no, like I think the way she does it, she speaks about it, she's oblivious to being a woman. She just was a person doing what she did, and she didn't have a lot of self-awareness of her place and how people maybe treated her differently, or she was just around such a small circle of people. She didn't have she had a cameraman, clearly never had a sound guy. She never recorded sound. She had her cameraman and a couple of models, and that was it. So her circle could be so small that she kind of was shielded from it, and the people around her treated her well, or she was just so oblivious to people treating her differently. But to her, being a woman never factored in her career in any kind of a way at all.
Yeah, well, I do find her films endearing. I do enjoy watching her films, and I think just by the virtue of the fact that she was a woman and she was producing, directing, writing these films, I think in a way that is kind of a feminist thing. She's kind of ahead of the curve. She was a pioneer, whether she intended to be or not, and whether she had any political ideas about it, it doesn't matter. I think just because she was doing it, she was important in that way.
Absolutely. So we kind of talked about her filmography, the evolution of these sex films. I want to get a little bit into her directing style and what makes her films unique, because we did say, like, with the porn, you can recognize a Wishman film. I mean, 2 minutes in, you're watching a Wishman film. Some of the
Yes.
characteristics is pretty much do it yourself type filmmaker, guerrilla filmmaker. Her voiceovers are very jarring. It's her and a couple of her friends. She claims they were professionals, but it's just the same 3 or 4 people that did all the voices in all of her movies. It all sounded like middle-aged men, Wishman, and maybe a couple of other girls that would rotate with these voices. But the voiceovers were always jarring because they didn't seem like they fit with the characters. She always shot in her apartment. She tried to make her apartment look as different as possible, different exteriors, different corners of different rooms. But most of her films were shot in and around her apartment. Another characteristic is a lot of out of focus shots. Focus wasn't part of, you can use focus as a double entendre. She wasn't very focused. Her shots wasn't very focused. Her decor was very tacky. She was a single Jewish woman living in New York. I don't think she was necessarily trendy in any type of a way. So I don't know if she was necessarily looking to have a nice aesthetics around her apartment. So because her apartment wasn't very aesthetic, her films weren't very aesthetic. I think we kind of joked, or I did at least, when we reviewed Paranormal Activity, that the filmmaker spent 90% of the budget renovating his house because he was shooting the film in his house. And I kind of mocked him for that. I'm like, yeah, you're just writing off your renovations for like a zero budget movie that you're shooting in your house. Well, I think Doris Wishman could have took his advice, even though he came out way after her. I mean, he was probably even born when she was doing some of these movies, but yeah, she probably should have spent some of her money renovating her apartment or her house or whatever and wrote that off, because visually it hurt her films. There weren't a lot of exterior shots. It was just an ugly apartment with very tacky things, and she would cut away to those things so often that you couldn't not notice them. Speaking of cutting away to things, she never recorded audio live. When people were talking, you either saw the back of their head, you saw the phone covering their mouth so you couldn't see their lips, or you saw the person they were talking to. So if I'm talking, it'd be a shot of you, and you're talking, it'd be a shot of me. So she'd use tactics like that because she didn't record audio live. And also, from this is what I found out from her an interview with an autobiographer, is that she directed after she said action. So she would say action. Let's say it's a scene going on. She'd say, okay, now you walk over there. Now you stand there. And she'd be saying this as the take was going on. So it made sense because she never bothered with audio anyway. So she could direct these actors as the scene was going on. So she directed during the scenes themselves. She always had female protagonists or mostly female protagonists. Multiple characters had voiceovers because obviously not recording audio, it helps if a lot of people had voiceovers, so that would get a lot of the dialogue out. She shot oftentimes without a script. Sometimes she would figure out what people were saying or where the plot was going as she was editing it and doing the voiceover. I think those were a lot of the major stuff. Also, while people were talking, I think we already mentioned she'd cut away to feet, hands, and the different objects in her room. And I remember that was super jarring for me the first time I saw one of her films because I'd see two people talking and then I'd see a shot of a tree, like a a fake tree in the corner of a room, and then when they stopped talking, we'd see the actors again. Then when they started talking, I'd see a shot of their foot, and then when they stopped talking, it was so jarring. And I think that's again one of the huge characteristics that you can find with her films. Anything I left out?
Well, I don't know her films as well as you do, but just based on my recent viewing here, I noticed she liked to use mirrors in a lot of shots. Do you think that's something she did in a lot of films? Or
Yeah, I would say she used mirrors a decent amount. Well, I mean, when you're in an apartment shooting all those movies, there's only so much freedom and so many things you can do. So anything she could do that was a little bit creative within the confines of an apartment, she kind of did. I don't think
I
that
thought,
if she did the mirror thing, I don't think it was as much as the things I mentioned, but I'm sure she probably did it multiple times.
no, I thought she made good use of it. And you know what you're saying about the recording with no sound, and that's a fairly common technique. You know, certain films where you don't record sound, and so yeah, you're always looking at the person who isn't talking. You know, it's very unusual. But I did notice that she kind of made that she had some moments. She made an effort to actually show people starting to speak, and so it kind of helped create the illusion that, oh yeah, this person's talking, and then she would kind of go to the back of the head or the other person, and or the foot or whatever it was. But I felt that there were at least moments where she made an effort to kind of show the lips moving, and I appreciated that.
So it doesn't sound like we're speaking that, glowingly about Doris. I mean, she wasn't a very good filmmaker. She didn't put a ton of effort into her films, but she was able to get films done. So why are we talking about her? Why are we highlighting her? For me, it's because when I started really investing in films, immediately Stanley Kubrick, Orson Welles, Akira Kurosawa, some of these filmmakers, and I can keep going on. I immediately thought, man, these films and these filmmakers and what they're doing is just so amazing. But none of that applied to me. I wasn't trained. I have no resources. I have some of the worst actors you can get. It's just people moonlighting as actors. So as much as I love those type of filmmakers and the films they made, I couldn't make those films. I had like 50 cents in my pocket. I had a camera I borrowed from a friend of mine and he'd help me shoot it. And it was just the two of us. We'd put out an ad, we'd get actors who were willing to work for free, who weren't union. And again, we're talking about bartenders and waitresses and people living at home with their parents. And it's like, hey, let's make a movie. And immediately what you realize is they don't take it serious. They don't memorize their lines. Sometimes they don't show up. They'll show up once and they won't show up again. So you have to constantly adjust. You have to have it in your mind that this person, if they show up today, if I don't get everything done with them today, I may not see them tomorrow and I may not have a movie I can finish. So while I do say certain things a little set that may sound a little snarky about Doris, I applied 90% of the things we talked about to help me get my movies finished. There was a scene in Hookers in Revolt, a movie I shot, where the actor didn't know his lines. I just had him put the cell phone up to his mouth so we couldn't see his lips. And I just said, dude, just ad lib as long as you want. I will cut up your scene. And when when you're talking, we'll just go in the other room, we'll record your audio and I'll play that audio and then we'll do it that way. There was another scene we had where a girl couldn't remember her lines. I was like, fine, I will hold the script up to your face. We'll have the camera right there, and you will just read your lines. And it'll be a close up so they can't see the script. Or I've had times where it's like, all right, you know what? Have the shot on me. I'll talk. And, when it's your time to talk, the camera will stay on me and it'll mainly be on me. And then we'll maybe have the back of your head. And so all I can keep going on, but all of these things I talked about, I apply to different movies I did. And I even did a tribute trailer, a roughy style trailer where it's like wanton desires and carnal lust for one of my movies as well. And I used like the title for her movies as taglines for mine's. Lust for Vengeance, the tagline was Bad Girls Go to Hell. And in Hookers and Revolts, one of the hookers say, Another Day, Another Man. So I pay huge homage to her in my films, and I've learned how to get films done by watching her films, because when you have such few resources, the goal isn't making a good film. The goal is making a film. And the one thing about Doris is she made a lot of films. You can say whatever you want about her films. There's a lot of filmmakers that call themselves filmmakers that have one or two films or just have a bunch of unfinished films. Doris Wishman, she died at 90 with a huge filmography.
True. When you write your autobiography, you can call it Everything I Know About Filmmaking I Learned from Doris Wishman.
You know what? Maybe I should. Maybe I should.
Why not?
Any final thoughts on Doris as a filmmaker or her filmography or the sex fiction genre?
I enjoyed Doris. I enjoy her films. I guess, as I've sometimes said, I have a high tolerance for films that a lot of people just can't watch or they just think are terrible. But I see something in these films. They're like a time capsule in a way. They're a window into a place and a time. And her style is interesting. I love the music. Actually love a lot of the photography. The black and white photography. There's some interesting shots. I just enjoy these movies. I don't know why exactly, but they appeal to me.
What would you say is your favorite Wishman film?
Well, I would probably have to go with either Deadly Weapons or Double Agent 73. Those are the two that I really know the best, and I find them irresistible.
Yeah, those are her more popular films. I just never got into them. I didn't find that Busty Morgan. I never found her attractive. I don't know. I had a friend like that, which just she's giant tits, and I dated her for a few months, and once you get over the giant tits, it's they just kind of they're kind of intrusive, and you kind of see like how encumbersome it is to these women because she couldn't really exercise. She couldn't do a lot of stuff because her tits were just so big.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people have commented that Chesty Morgan isn't really that attractive, and I think she kind of, if it wasn't for the huge breasts, she probably wouldn't have had a career as a stripper. That it was a gimmick, right? It was a total gimmick. And even the breasts, some people have commented that they don't really look that good. They're huge, but they're not necessarily beautiful. I don't know that I'm going to go that far, but I can see that she's not necessarily everybody's dream girl.
Judging her attractiveness is just that that was the appeal of the movie.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Not singling out her because of her looks, but that was the appeal of the movie. Is oh my god, this sexy, gorgeous, big-breasted woman. If you're not into that, then it's just a woman with big tits just like sitting on a couch for 90% of the movie.
Yeah, I remember reading the description of Deadly Weapons, and it said something like she murders men with her breasts, or she kills men with her breasts. And I thought, oh man, this is going to be amazing. I had visions of how she was going to use her breasts as weapons, but it's pretty tame, though. You know, she just kind of smothers them. She doesn't really.
Yeah, I
She,
think
she
part of that was the actress herself, Busty Morgan, is she didn't want to do much. She wanted people out of the room when she did nude scenes. She'd show up late. She, was very difficult to work with. And also, Wishman isn't that creative to make her do a bunch of other things, even if she wanted to. So even though the premise is interesting, the execution wasn't very good, even if you were into it. They didn't really, like you said, they didn't really do a lot of creative things. And it was kind of disappointing.
yeah, fair enough.